Hey guys, how's it going? Hope you're doing well. My name is Crown, and today I'm going to read you some very interesting stories that I hope that you're gonna love. And now, without further ado, let's go! So this happened earlier today and I'm still in shock. I love the out of work here stories and figured I'd post this. Enjoy my first out of work here story. The cast, me, avid Pokemon enthusiast, the store employee, and the Team Rocket Karen. The story. So I, a 33-year-old male, a huge lover of Pokemon, had just gotten paid and decided I wanted to buy myself a Valentine's gift. I went to my local chain video game store, let's call it Video Game Go, because they have all kinds of collectibles. Having been there several times, I had seen a 24-inch Eevee plushie that I really liked. Perfect. Eevee is one of my favorite Pokemon, and this particular plushie could also be used for cosplay. Having grabbed my plushie and paid for it, and the bank that would give me a $5 discount on any collectibles that would fit inside it, I decided to look around for anything I might want to get on my next visit. Now, as it's rather cold here in Texas, I was bundled up in several layers, including rather warm, comfortable sweatpants, a large ski jacket, a stocking hat, a scarf, and had my backpack on with Snuggles the Eevee in her exclusive Cordy eating noodles collectible bag. The employees of this particular video game chain store generally wear jeans, a t-shirt with a store logo or something similar, and a lanyard with a badge showing their name and a company logo on it. So there is no way I could possibly be confused as an employee. Enter Karen. Cue Team Rocket encounter music. Karen wants to battle. She had that typical Karen haircut and a look that screamed, "Where is your manager?" She said, "Excuse me, do you guys have Game X?" What? She said the following in a clapback way. "Do you have Game X? God, some people are so slow." Again, I say, what? She snapped her fingers. "I want Game X. I'm going to buy it for my son." I snuggle the Eevee, still confused. I don't know, maybe? At this point, I started to realize this lady thinks I'm an employee. How her tiny Team Rocket brain made that connection is a mystery to me. I clearly don't look like an employee. How do you not know? Are you stupid? Whoa, lady, there is no need for that language. This is a family store. Besides, I don't work here. I just came to get this plushie. Don't lie to me. Of course you work here. You shouldn't be shopping when you're working. What? I'm now starting to get mad. I just wanted to browse the store. Lady, what about me makes you think I work here? I look so bad. Why don't you go over to the counter and ask the actual employee for your game? Leave me alone. At this point, an employee who has heard the whole exchange finally finished up whatever he was doing and comes over. What's going on here? Karen opened her mouth to start yelling at the poor employee. I've worked retail for most of my life and have dealt with Karens and entitled people a lot. I wasn't going to let her spew her nonsense. I say, this witch assumed I work here. When I tried to tell her I don't, she lost her patience. That's a lie. This bum just came over and pretended to work here. He stole my stuffed animal. I demand you throw him out and call the police. The employee and I just stared at her in disbelief. Did she seriously try that nonsense? The employee tells her, "Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you to leave. You're clearly harassing this customer. I heard everything that was said. Also, I literally just sold this plushie to him. He even has a receipt for it in his hand. Now please leave before I call the police." She faltered and started saying, But, leave now, lady. Security. While storming out of the store, she shouted, "See if I ever shop here again. And you can be sure I'll be calling corporate about the customer service in this place." The employee and I looked at each other and burst out laughing at the absurdity of the whole situation. He said, "Sorry about that, dude. Is there something in the store I can offer as compensation?" "Nah, dude, we're good. I have a new story for Reddit now." He laughed, hooked me up with store credits, and promised to look up the story and upvote it. I took my Eevee plushie and headed out to get something to eat, still trying to wrap my head around the stupidity of some people. This story takes place about 2 years ago. The cast will be my father, who is the founder and owner of a chain of pharmacies and served this customer is going to be referred to as Dad. Our victim, the old lady. Note that she's very old and uses a walker. And our offender, Karen. The story starts with Dad serving the old lady who has been coming to the pharmacy for years and is on very close terms with him. Everything goes as normal and Dad gives over the medication that is prescribed for her. After she had paid for the prescriptions, Dad assisted her to her husband's car and began to head inside when he heard a sudden yelp. He looked behind the car to see a middle-aged woman standing over the old lady with her medication in hand. The Karen looks at my dad and begins to take off down the street to a side alley right next to the pharmacy. Dad immediately goes to help the old lady up before starting to chase after the Karen. Although she had a moderate head start, Karen was quite unfit, and it didn't take Dad long to catch her. He tackled her from behind and pinned the Karen down. He tried to yell at her, but before he could, the lady screamed, "What are you doing? Get off me! This is assault! I am calling the police!" Dad yelled back at her, "You assaulted an elderly woman and stole her medication. What do you think you're doing?" He then takes out his phone and dials the police. After he informs them of the situation, with Karen interjecting with her side of the story constantly, they tell him that they are sending a car over and to keep the woman pinned. After the call, the Karen begins to scream and says, "My kids need this medication." She doesn't. My dad snaps back. That old lady had medication for her recovery from cancer. Unless one of your kids has just recovered from chemotherapy, I doubt they would need this medication. The police arrive shortly after, and immediately the Karen begins screaming about pressing charges. At this stage, a large crowd had gathered, and an ambulance had been called for the old lady. The police take both statements, and when my dad informs them about the camera footage caught by the security cameras, they go and check to confirm what has happened. Karen is then escorted to the back of the car and ends up serving 1 year for aggravated assault and robbery. Thankfully, the old lady was not injured. This is just one of the many stories that my dad has told me. One has even involved me. So if there is any interest, I will tell you some more. Backstory. So basically I worked at a fast casual burger chain. It's not a very large one, but it was franchised. This chain I worked at was owned and managed by a very young university dropout whose parents bought him this franchise. It was entirely staffed by females, plus me, male. He had no experience in managing or leading a restaurant. I had worked there as part of the original crew and eventually became a supervisor there. This is when the problem started. I was a 15-year-old male working part-time, so he didn't take many of my opinions seriously. When I got my first paycheck, I noticed no pay increase. It's generally a well-known fact that increased responsibilities meant increased pay of any sort. And this is when I started to dislike working there, as I was supervising adults who were being paid more than I was simply because adults had a higher minimum wage. His response to me was that he couldn't afford it. While I obviously can prove it, but with my shifts under my leadership, our customer reviews were consistently 5-star reviews. I never once received lower than 5 stars during my shifts as I focused on customer service. The manager, however, was greedy and never understood the concept of customer service. With many shifts, when a customer would complain about cold fries or an undercooked burger, he simply would tell them they were wrong. Of course, these customers were never to return. He was a cocky jerk and a horrible manager who was consistently absolutely useless. Due to his treatment of customers, he had an abysmal income of roughly $8,000 per week. A manager should never be making comments on their employees like my coworker and I, who were too fat to be sitting on his chair because we would break it with our weight. I play football. I'm not fat, I just have a large muscle mass. One time I worked during a holiday. I was expecting the provincial holiday pay in accordance with provincial requirements. He never paid me appropriately, and when I, along with many other co-workers under my direction, approached him about the pay, he promptly told me it was not my place to talk to him about the law as he was the owner and I was just a high schooler. He said to me, "According to the law, you're not entitled to this pay," which was not accurate whatsoever. Whatever. One night during a close, which I had covered for the only other supervisor who had called in sick, We had no customers, none, for the 2 hours leading up to close. So I made the decision to shut down the fryers 15 minutes early so that our staff could get out earlier. This would have saved him money. Of course, we had a customer come in 5 minutes before close, and I greeted him. He asked for only fries, and of course, I had to unfortunately let him know that we had no fries left as we were about to close. This customer begged for us to turn on the fryers again and make them fries, and I said no. That's a story for another subreddit. This customer angrily left me my first and only 1-star review because we were out of fries at that time. I understand that had I left the fryers on, this would have been avoided. Regardless, the next morning I arrived at my shift and he approached me and gave me a verbal warning about the incident and said that he would be deducting the cost of the fries, the order, and the penalty for the 1-star rating at a cost of $80. Something he had never done before with anyone. After he did that, with me furious about this request as it was completely unfair, I did some legal research. I then screenshotted the appropriate legislation and texted him, saying that it was completely illegal. He didn't respond. 10 minutes before the end of my shift, he fired me for repeated poor performance. After this, I informed all of my prior colleagues about the incident and asked them all to contact the Ontario Labour Board, and so began the arduous process of the Labour Board. 8 months later, the Labour Board sided with all of us for wrongful terminations. I received $3,500 from my termination, along with my termination pay. As it turns out, in fact, he did underpay me on every single one of my holiday shifts. I'm not too sure how much the others received, but overall from all of us, it totaled around $15,000 to $18,000. I then got a job right next door at a restaurant whose glass faced my previous workplace, and every morning I got to see him running around as he was short-staffed, and many of my co-workers quit when I was fired because he was a devil to work with. I found out after this from his cousin, who went to high school with me, that he had sold his car to pay for our bills. A 2017 Mercedes C300, stopped paying royalties and then got sued by the franchise owners for breach of contract. The restaurant was subsequently shut down and he was out of income over $1.5 in fries. From last I heard, he now works at his father's fast food restaurant as a regular employee. This is a pretty recent story for me that finally had its conclusion a couple of weeks ago, and someone told me to post it here. So I figured why not. One more thing before I get all into it. Every story has a silver lining, and this is mine. It doesn't take away from the fact, though, that it was caused by much worse circumstances that no one should have to go through, and anyone who's been through the same as I have can attest to it. If anyone out there right now is going through domestic violence or emotional abuse, I urge you to contact the authorities. And I'm always available to chat as well if you need advice or such. Anyway, all this started a couple of months ago with an incident between my parents. It's important to note I still live with them, but have been working and providing for myself since graduating in the summer, and I'm fully self-sufficient. My father has always been an abusive person, albeit one that did support his family at the time, but due to his lack of self-control and outbreaks, the situation was more often tense than not, especially between me and him as the power began to shift and I stopped relying on him. So yeah, a couple of months ago, an abusive incident between him and my mother occurred, which started my mother's silent treatment of him for about 2 weeks when he decided to get physical again, this time against me, which resulted in a bigger fight, and in the process my younger sister's shoulder got hurt. My mother broke her nose and I called the cops. He was arrested that day and had a restraining order filed against him for 10 days. All temporary, as the police over here in Switzerland tend to avoid stepping in more than necessary, and did this for our protection while leaving us to make further decisions. An important thing to note is that my mother has always been a stay-at-home mom, especially since my sister is still underage and she doesn't have a formal education to make much money in this country. So for her, divorce was more something like a last resort, and she attempted to try and get family counseling/couples therapy set up, which didn't turn out so well. At that point, we got her a lawyer and began the proceedings. I also studied law myself to an extent before going into my current field, so a lot of what happened here I was well equipped for, which did make things easier. This is where the money part starts. Our family has been pretty well off ever since I can remember. So my sister and I both have had somewhere in the ballpark of $150,000 each saved up for our schooling, first cars and so on. Half of this money was put into accounts in our name. While our parents could still access them, the money was legally ours. The other half was put into accounts in our grandparents' names in the US for logistical reasons. The day of my first court hearing, I was in the process of transferring said account fully into my name, as I was expecting something like what did end up happening to happen. Later, when the transfer succeeded, I found that almost all the money, up to a fairly round number, was transferred to my father's locked pension plan. This was a surprise to me, as to my knowledge until then, only my mother was supposed to have direct access to it, while my father would have had to have the bank card, which I knew was with him. So after some checking, I found out my mother wasn't fully aware of when she had signed forms that gave him access, but more on that later. As I was now down on a big chunk of money, part of it was my literal income I had been saving, it was time to get my own lawyer. In addition to this transfer, back when we were building our house, my father took a loan from my account, which was understood to be a mutual agreement and he should pay me back at a given time. Knowing a little about how his lawyer operated, the number of offenses he potentially had to his name, and the fact that my mother and sister were now open to pressing charges against him if it came to it, I had a feeling that this would end up in an out-of-court agreement. I set up a meeting with my lawyer and collected as much evidence as possible regarding the transactions and ownership of the account. While my father did have the legal papers to manage my account in Switzerland, that means any action is meant to be taken in my best interest. His pension plan doesn't concern me, so any reasonable judge would rule in my favor. Additionally, my mother's lawyer became aware of the situation as she legally represented my sister as well, who lost a similar amount of money due to the same thing. Before I even met my lawyer, he and my mother's lawyer discussed the situation and managed to create a good picture of it. So finally, the first meeting. I discussed the situation with my lawyer as my father assaulted me. I had the option to press charges, as well as request damages made and possibly sue him for the money. But to this day, it's hard for me to say if I'd have managed to get all of it back with that method, as courts would have trouble recognizing his debt to me from the house loan, not to mention the insane costs involved with starting a legal case against someone in your own family. Knowing my father, I also knew that he wouldn't shy from spending thousands of dollars to protect himself in court with better lawyers, which was exactly why my lawyer figured it would be better to come to a settlement, as I certainly had more I could use against my father than vice versa, with the only difference being that this way I might get a lot more out of it than the money he only just took recently. At this point, I'd like to note that my grandparents had officially caught myself, my mother, and my sister out because they didn't agree with the decision for us to stay away from my father. They insisted on a need for family therapy, whereas we had already decided there was no point, and my mother was divorcing him while I decided to get a lawyer and fight for myself. My father also managed to allege that I had hit him on the day of the incident, which was another reason for me to make sure that no one could claim I accepted that statement for the obvious lie it was. Since my grandparents caught me out, I could say goodbye to that half of the money already. No way to sue for it, nor was I legally entitled to it, so the bank couldn't do much. This is where it gets interesting though. My lawyer created a whole list of things we could use against my father, ranging from the recent incident to cases from the past that I had written up when this all started, as well as using statements from my old teachers and my therapist to create the skeleton for a case that would certainly get expensive. The whole point of this was to have a solid foundation on which we could then approach my father's attorney and suggest a settlement for the money taken out of my account recently, as well as him returning the loan for the house. He was hesitant at first and even suggested to my mother that she and he would together pay off a small part of it over time as a compromise, but that clearly wasn't an option for me. After hearing this, I contacted my lawyer once again and had him double down on our very specific demands. We wanted to come to an agreement for $50,000. In exchange, I would drop the charges and leave him alone. This also meant, in return, he would have to let go of the claims that I hit him, essentially closing the case for both parties. There was also a deadline for me to continue as a case, leaving him 3 more days to consider it. Luckily, the whole thing seemed to be a game of chicken, with him waiting until the night before the deadline to finally agree to our request. His lawyer contacted us and eventually wrote an email saying that they agreed with our requests and would be glad to sign a contract on the matter, making it up to my lawyer now to write up the contract and end the whole deal. The funny part about this whole exchange was that my father's statements that were part of the email to us, claiming that they had just as much of a case against me and could press charges if they so pleased, listing a bunch of things I had allegedly done that would warrant a countersuit. In the end, seeing that they agreed to pay me all that money, I'm quite sure those statements were just to show that they weren't afraid more than anything else really. Since if they truly believed the allegations, they would have just proceeded with the case. Now, a couple of days later, I received a transaction for all the money that we agreed on, and the case is officially over for me. The irony of it all is my grandparents caught me out and probably encouraged my father to do what he did regarding the last money I had left to my name. In the end, all the money that was in the US was the money my father used to pay me back, since the pension plan he paid the money into was locked, and he had no other quick financial means to reach the settlement. So a big chunk of money went down the drain on lawyers, and most of the money saved for me ended up with me. The part that landed in the pension plan even came with its own benefits. As my parents are still married, my mother gets 50% of it in a divorce. All of this did come at a cost though, which is why the first thing I sit and exposed is the most important to me. My mental health has suffered a lot from all this, and I've never been so burnt out. Not only that, I need more psychiatric attention than ever, and my relationship with my father's side of the family is forever ruined. So while that last part was necessary, they were toxic, manipulative, and abusive. Picking his side after all the incidents they knew about, and also knowing that there were more they didn't know about, take on a person can affect your entire life. Which is why I once again want to stress that if anyone out there is going through anything remotely similar, to please reach out to people you can trust. Contact the authorities or something like that. You don't need to be stuck in that situation for as long as I was, which is a whole nother story. This was my first encounter with one of those Karens. Oh boy, how bad it is. First, a bit of a backstory. Even though it's still COVID time, we have our basketball training again. Our country is not in that bad of a situation with a pandemic, but still has some rules to follow. You need to wear a mask while being on a bus, and there are marked seats in which you must not sit. On to the story. So my friend and I finish our training and go to wait for our bus. When we think about where we could sit close to one another, we found a 4-seat part of the bus where 2 people can sit. Some time passes, and when we stop at one station, it's where the entitled mother and her nice kid enter the bus. She had a classic Karen look. She was even wearing sunglasses in the middle of winter on a cloudy day. She was talking to someone on her phone, and oh, she wasn't wearing her mask, while her child did. She starts looking for a place where she and her son can sit together. She spots me and my friend and sees that there are 2 empty seats, one in front of the other facing one another. But the problem was that the seats were marked with a big X, so even if you don't go by bus regularly, you can clearly see you shouldn't sit there. When they get close to us, I start to get a bit nervous. I point to the big X on both of the seats. The entitled mother completely ignores me and still talks on her phone. I was getting mad at this point because I don't want to catch the virus. Then her kid kicks in. Mom, we shouldn't sit here. It's marked with an X. Let's look for another place. She was still talking on her phone and not paying attention. At this point, I am furious. You can clearly see where you can sit and where you can't. I pointed it out and her son did too. What else does she need to realize that's not a place you should sit at? She finally sits down next to my friend and me, but her nice kid refuses. She threatened him that he will get grounded when they get home if he doesn't sit. So he does, but you can clearly see he's uncomfortable. I try talking to her again and telling her she shouldn't sit there. Excuse me. She moves her phone away from her ear. Hey sweetie, how can I help you? She puts her phone back instantly. I tried saying something but she didn't hear me. I tried to talk to her again after a few minutes. A bit angrily now I say, excuse me, but you shouldn't sit here, it's marked with an X. She moves her phone away. Yeah, I'm still listening. She puts her phone back on her ear. A few more minutes pass and I'm getting very mad. I decide to try to talk to her again. Now very angrily and loud I kinda yell, excuse me, you're not supposed to sit here. It's marked by an X. On her phone she says, I'll talk to you later. Then to me, very angrily she continues, listen here you little brat. You aren't telling me what to do or where to sit. Did your parents not teach you to respect your elders? I say, first, my parents taught me well enough what I should and shouldn't do. Second, I am not telling you what you should or shouldn't do or where you should or shouldn't sit. It's what the government says. The only thing I'm doing is pointing out your mistake to you. No one can tell me what I can do, especially not someone that dumb. She calls me dumb even though she's the one not wearing a mask and not social distancing. I will get you kicked out of this bus. Watch me. I want to see that. She proceeded to call a conductor to confront me and get my friend and me out of the bus. The conductor tells her, lady, what's the problem here? Why aren't you wearing your mask and why are you sitting on seats marked with an X? Sir, it's because those two young men stole my mask and pushed me and my child from my seats. Is that true? Sir, of course not. I get cut off by her kid. Sir, these guys right here didn't do anything wrong. It's my mom who is lying. She doesn't have a mask and forced me to sit here. I add, oh, and she threatened him she will beat him if he doesn't listen. I've heard enough. Ma'am, you're getting out of this bus right now. He then shouts to the driver, stop right here. We have to kick someone out and call the cops. The bus stopped, the mother and kid got kicked out, and the conductor went out with them while calling the police. We continued our trip while the conductor stayed there with them to wait for the police. I hope that witch gets in some trouble for not following the rules during the pandemic and threatening her child, but I feel bad for the kid. I don't give him more than 11, but he's already smarter than his mom. I hope his dad is better than his mom. So a little bit of backstory, my younger sister, by 10 plus years, used to have bad social anxiety when she was little, but my parents got her into therapy and she got significantly better throughout the years. Now she's 100% functioning. She's very talkative and funny when dealing with family or friends and just a bit shy when dealing with strangers. Basically the only occasions when her old anxiety kicks in is when she's supposed to speak in public or when strangers get confrontational with her, which is, as you probably understand, what's important to this story. Anyway, enough about my sister. About 2 years ago, she was 18 at the time. I got back home after being out of the country for several months and decided to take my sister shopping because she had a birthday just a few weeks earlier. She is a very talented artist, and back then she was at a stage when she was convinced that artists are supposed to dress classy, which meant that when I picked her up, she was dressed in gray trousers, a white shirt, and a vest. Kind of like this, to give you some perspective. My point is, she looked very official. Anyway, we went shopping. She wanted mainly some painting supplies, and on our way home, I decided to stop in a big hardware store because I needed some stuff for a hiking trip with my friends. She went inside with me and wandered off to look at some other stuff while I did my shopping. I was done maybe in 10 minutes, and as I was pushing my cart towards the registers and looking around to see whether I'd see my sister, I heard some guy screaming at someone, presumably an employee, about how incompetent they were and that he's getting them fired and so on. Just some general stuff you see here mentioned all the time. I don't exactly remember it to the last word. The guy sounded very angry and used a lot of profanities. I didn't pay much attention. Normally, I'm the kind of person who would probably stand up for that poor employee, but then I was really tired and didn't feel like dealing with it. However, as I was crossing the aisle where this incident was taking place, I realized to my horror that it's not an employee getting screamed at, it is my sister. This guy who looked like someone dressed an extra from Mad Max in a business suit, he looked really comical, was holding her by her hand, shouting profanities right in her face. She looked absolutely terrified and on the verge of tears. I immediately went into protective brother mode, sprinted across those 10 meters, and shoved the guy away from my sister while screaming at him to leave her alone. He let go of her and looked dumbfounded at first. Then he got aggressive, started going off about who I think I am and other nonsense. Then he started shoving me back, but I was much heavier and taller, so I just wrestled him to the ground, where he just kept screaming incomprehensibly. By this point, the commotion had already attracted the attention of an employee who promptly called a manager and a security guard. I told him what happened, and the guy calmed down a bit, so I let him go, and he started ranting about how he's going to sue us all but didn't try to get physical again. The manager called the police, who took statements from all of us, even my sister, who was finally able to speak normally, and reviewed the footage from the cameras. Apparently what happened before I got involved was this. My sister was checking out some electronics and noticed some headphones or something had fallen off the shelf, so she starts putting it back. The guy sees her, and since she's dressed in official-looking clothes, he thinks she's an employee or a manager and stands beside her, waiting until he gets her attention. My sister plucks him out at first because she doesn't realize he wants something from her. After a while, the guy gets visibly annoyed, grabs her by the shoulder, and flips out on her about how unprofessional she is and so on. My sister, being as shy she is shocked and stutters over herself, unable to explain that she doesn't work there. Apparently this just makes him more mad. He gets progressively more aggressive and actually slaps her. Luckily not too hard, it was more like the kind of slap you give someone when you want to wake them up. A few seconds later I appear and you know the rest. So what happened next? Cops cuffed that psycho, much to his surprise. I remember he actually said, "What the heck are you doing? Why aren't you arresting him? He attacked me." He just wasn't able to comprehend that grabbing my sister's arm and slapping her wasn't okay. He was later charged with assault and I believe he got probation, a couple hundred hours of public service, and had to attend anger management therapy. We didn't really care. The store manager apologized, even though we didn't blame the store in any way, and gave us some vouchers. My sister was a bit shaken, but she was physically okay aside from a small bruise from how he held her hand. The end.